All right. Good afternoon, everybody, unless you're on the West Coast. Well, it would be just noon then. I am Josh Starr. I'm the CEO of PDK International. Normally, Olka Joshi Hansen, who's the Chief Program Officer for Grantmakers for Education, would be kicking this off, but her internet went down. That's the age we live in now, right? On one hand, it's great that we can get together virtually in ways that we couldn't, but we are subject to the vagaries of technology. And so I'm going to do my best to do a little bit of her introduction. We are thrilled at PDK to be partnered with Grantmakers for Education and the Spencer Foundation on a series of conversations about the possibilities of education going into the future. We have been producing a series of articles from some real luminaries in the space to help us think through what should we be organizing around over the next 25 years? What might education look like 25 years down the road? And these conversations are intended to ask a lot of questions. We're not going to answer all the questions. None of us would be so bold to think that we have all the answers, but we like to think that it's a great opportunity to ask them. Oh, and Olka just got back on, so I'm going to actually stop because I'm going to come back to this. Olka Hansen has just got back on. She can take it over and pick up where I left off and correct all my mistakes that I've made thus far. So
there
Olka,
were
turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone, and I'm sorry to be late on this. Yes, internet went down, but welcome. On behalf of Celine Coggins, who's our executive director, and the rest of our Grantmakers for Education team, we're really grateful to you for taking the time today to join us. As Josh said, we are excited to bring this series on the future of education to you. As we emerge out of COVID, it feels like the right moment to really think about what it is that we want to rebuild. Our first session was last week, and it was on why we need to reimagine education. So a really big picture look. And we're going to have a series of 6 to 8 programs that include the curriculum today. We will have a session on teaching and learning coming up in a couple of weeks, followed by assessment, and then we'll delve into areas like policy. But for today, really grateful to our panelists. And Josh, now I will hand it back to you to start our panel. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I said, at PDK Kappan Magazine, we are really thrilled to partner with GFE and very much appreciate the support of the Spencer Foundation to ask the right questions. When I always tell people when I was an accountability guy, I always used to say that a best day to help you ask good questions. And so today we're gonna be talking about curriculum and what it means and how we should be thinking about curriculum from a broad level, right? And part of the idea behind this series is that we're tackling it from 3 angles, right? Researchers have a lot of information about the effect of treatments, right? What actually works? We know something about what works and what to do and what not to do. Funders have a lot of great theories about what we could be doing, a lot of great ideas. They want to invest in new and innovative things. And then practitioners say, well, okay, here's the reality of the world, and here's the politics, and here's actually how you have to move things to transform a school system. So in these conversations, we like to bring these various legs of the stool together to talk about what's possible. And so today, as we talk about the goals and scope of the pre-K-12 curriculum, we are really honored to have some 4 wonderful leaders in the field in this conversation. So you see, we have Dr. Pam Cantor, who's the founder and senior science advisor of Turnaround for Children, Dr. Joe Davis, superintendent of Ferguson Florissant, Missouri, Dr. Carol Lee, professor emerita of education at Northwestern, and Judy Wurtzel, the Senior Director, Education Grantmaking at Schusterman Family Philanthropies. And of course, you might hear my dog out there as well, who might want to chime in on this as the afternoon goes on. So I am thrilled that each of them has joined us today. And I want to start the conversation by touching on Carol's piece that she wrote for us recently, which of course you can find on Kappan Online. And I'm going to ask Carol, just kind of tee it up for a minute or two on this notion that you have that education, public education, serves democratic purposes, right? And when we're serving a democracy, and when we're serving a democracy, we should not just think about the idea that kids should attain mastery of content. There's something more to it that we need in order to thrive and function in our democracy, right? So talk a little bit about that and about what you laid out in the piece and what you hope we can start organizing around in our schools so that kids can really be thriving in a democracy, not just achieving the standards that have been set. So talk a little bit about that to kick us off.
Well, first, thanks for inviting me, one, to do the article that we're discussing today. And I'd like to draw attention to the audience to the National Academy of Education website, where there's a report that we developed called Educating for Civic Reasoning and Discourse. And in that report, we outline the sort of broad parameters of the kinds of knowledge and dispositions that young people need to develop in order to engage with the challenges we have in the civic domain. And we draw in part on an argument Amy Gutman made some years ago, others certainly have, that public education is actually the only vehicle in a democratic society that can prepare young people for engagement in the broader demands of what we're required to navigate. Certainly you had mentioned, Josh, the reality of the world that we're living in. We certainly are in an era of great contestation over many, many ideas. And as both citizens and persons living in the context of the United States, we have pathways and responsibilities to weigh in on these issues. What I tried to argue in the article was actually a slightly different issue about what I think the research community can bring. And that is, what are some foundational principles about human learning and development that schools, curricula, teacher education, assessments, and the like need to take into account to understand what contributes to robust learning. And that involves not only knowledge, it involves epistemological orientations to valuing complexity. It involves dispositions to consider multiple points of view and competing evidence. And so with those, and to create environments in which all stakeholders, the children themselves, teachers, administrators, et cetera, feel efficacious, feel safe, and feel that the activities in which they're engaged are relevant. And so I have argued in this piece that if we take those broad assumptions into account, one, the public good in preparing young people to engage in the dilemmas of civic participation, if you will, on the one hand, and the multiple aspects, if you will, that contribute to robust human learning and development, that those become the sort of criteria through which we look at curriculum development. And particularly because the audience here are persons involved in the philanthropic community in supporting curriculum and work in schools, it's important to remember, I think, first, that curriculum for robust teaching is never a recipe, but a resource, which means that all those involved in carrying out the aims and goals of that curriculum need to be emboldened with both scientific understanding and the artistry, if you will, of teaching. And that the curriculum is taken up in an ecological system that involves multiple stakeholders. How districts think about issues of accountability, or states, or the federal government for that matter, think about issues of accountability, which means if you introduce curriculum that the state doesn't consider important, and it's likely that teachers are not going to take it up. There are also, just to close out, I would say that among the arguments that I made in the article is that there are challenges to rethinking even the nature of the disciplines that we teach in curriculum, understanding the social construction of knowledge in each of these disciplines, understanding what role teaching in these content areas can play to helping people understand issues around climate change and viral mutation, and what we should do about the filibuster and the electoral college. There's a role across all subject matters across the K-12 curriculum to prepare young people to engage in this work.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So Pam, your background and expertise is really thinking about how kids enter into that space, right? How they are developmentally, if we're going to do this work, like what is it that kids, what is it that actually, I should say flip side, what is it that adults need to know about kids in order for them to actually learn at the higher levels and the deeper levels and broader levels that Carol is describing? Talk a little bit about the child development aspects of this work and what we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. The wonderful convergence in what Carol is talking about is that you can actually achieve goals of human learning and also goals of human development, the development of higher order skills because of the same neurodevelopmental processes. And here's what I mean by that. Basically, learning happens for kids because of three foundational principles: the incredible malleability of the human brain, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context, that ecological context that Carol just mentioned. But emotional salience, the relevance of what is being learned to the young person, is the driver. It's the spark that energizes the neurodevelopmental processes. Salience is created when experience is built on a child's own frame of reference, from home, from the community, from the classroom, or their own prior history. When this knowledge and frame are used by a young person, that young person gets to express the frame of reference in a classroom. And the message is, what you know matters, and you matter. And human growth, whether it is the wiring of the brain for learning or building an ethical core or the capacity to empathize and love, comes from experiences and relationships that are biologically mediated. Because really powerful hormones like oxytocin and neurotransmitters are released when children feel this kind of connection and relevance to the material that they are learning. And once those hormones are released, neurons connect to neurons. When neurons connect to neurons, capacities are built for increasingly complex skills, including motivation, curiosity, exploration. So relevance and salience directly matter to human learning. And that is much bigger than curriculum and content. It's about experience.
So great, right? That's all. Well, that is certainly powerful and true. But Joe, I want to ask you to sort of respond to that, and in two ways. And I might be convoluting two questions, so bear with me here, right? Because on one hand, you have been really focused on a very high standard for kids in Ferguson, Florissant, which is mostly a Black and brown district. And I think about this notion of educating for democracy and educating to be a better citizen in some ways. And you took over Ferguson, Florissant right after the Michael Brown tragedy, right? And so is AP calculus, which I know you're so passionate about, the most important thing for kids in Ferguson, Florissant post Michael Brown? Or like, how do you meld those two together so that we're attending to incredibly important but potentially polemic issues here?
Yeah, no, that's Thank you, Josh, for asking that question and just listening to Carol's context and how Pam sort of lays it out. I'd love to dive deeper into the brain and how that works, right? Because I was making a lot of connections of my own. When I came to Ferguson, I applied for this job because of what happened to Michael Brown. Being a Black man in America and then seeing this little Black baby laying in the street for 4 hours, just it's pulled my heart to this place. And this is a community that has changed over time from the 70s to now with white flight and so many things that have changed in our country and in this area. Education is always, to me, at the core of the work itself. One of the connections I heard Carol say was around how oxytocin gets us focused on and triggers sort of that motivation when you hear things that are relevant or maybe see people who are relevant. For me, I think there are a lot of ways. I don't think there's a way in this regard. I think there are a lot of ways to get to yes, but for me, it's mathematics, because I believe STEM and STEAM careers are at the core of where we're going as a country, as a world, when it comes to educating all children, but especially our Black children and our brown children, right? I think mathematics is the civil rights issue of our day, and I think that I know that I feel that way largely because of my own experience, right? How I was trained when I was in high school and all the way through college. I went to an HBCU undergrad. My undergrad was in computer science. I was a math person, right? And what I see is that too many of our students, Black, brown, white, aren't prepared for AP Calculus and the careers that come, as a result of some of that training. And I think that those standards have to be high. I speak from the math perspective because of my own experience as a math teacher and principal and superintendent and so on. But what I'm finding is that when students have that sort of calculus training, that problem solving skill set that is so important, that they have so many more choices. When we looked at our data, so many more students who go that route are able to go to the selected colleges and universities. But there's an even deeper issue when you think about educating our kids for liberty and democracy. Too many of our children don't get to AP Calculus and that track, and it starts in 6th grade, because if they don't get into the pre-algebra or at least algebra 1 by the time they leave 8th grade, they don't get to the AP Calculus by the time they become seniors. And as we dug deeper into the work here in Ferguson, we find that it's rooted even further in elementary mathematics. And so I think that when students learn earlier on those problem-solving skill sets and learning at deep levels, then they are able to get to the AP Calculus. Now, here's what I've seen it do for students. My son is one of them. My 16-year-old Black son who's in pre-cal now, 11th grade and doing well. He's a science guy. But when students learn those skill sets, it builds a confidence for lots of reasons. But I think what they learn and who they learn it from matters. And so what we've done is hung our hat on giving students early in the elementary school those foundational skills they need so that they build the confidence. So when they get to all the courses, not just math, who am I in this world? And democratically, where's my voice? And how do I find that voice, right? And so we've hung our hats there because we've seen that, we've been able to get our graduation rate up to 94% in 4 years. Our Black and brown babies and our white babies are graduating at high levels. But what we're finding is that they don't have the 12th grade level of learning that we want them to have. And it, I think, is rooted further into math and other areas as well. But we believe strongly that if our students go through the AP Calculus route, that we are opening doors for them to access the things that Carol was talking about a few moments ago, educating our children for a democratic society and then finding their place in this world. And I strongly believe, you all, that math is the game changer, AP Calc specifically.
So what I'm hearing, I'm going to go to Judy on, I want to start thinking about this from a little different direction, but what I'm starting to hear is that, like, it's not either or. I mean, come on, duh, it's right. We always tend to oversimplify in public education, but rich content and attending to children's emotional needs and teaching them, at a high level, they're not mutually exclusive, right? Even though we sometimes tend to think of it, either we're doing, we're attending to the whole child or we're teaching at a high level, right? And I think that's what I'm hearing from all three of you. But Judy, I want to turn to you. Like, you've been in the policy and funding arena for a while, right? You've seen how these things work at the high level, right? And have really been driving work now, of course, Schusterman around that. So what is it that you, and this may be an unfair question, so forgive me, but what do you wish you had known then that you know now, right, about this issue of curriculum and what Carol and Pam have laid out, right? Because as we think about this connection between curriculum and civic responsibility, deeper meaning, attention to a child's like real, attachment to it. But that's not the way we've been doing things for the last 20 years in some ways. So what do you make of all? Let me keep it kind of open in that way.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be a part of this incredible panel. And reflecting on that question, Josh, I guess I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think as a country, we focused on standards and accountability, and we miss the importance of curriculum as a way of bringing standards to life and supporting teachers with the tools they needed to make the shifts that the standards may have called for. One can have questions about the value of the standard or the specifics of the standards, but they do ask for kind of a deeper kind of learning. They ask for kids to grapple with meaningful math tasks, to think about procedural, but also conceptual knowledge and application. They ask for students to really dig into meaningful text. And curriculum can be a tool that helps that happen, or it can close that down depending on how the design of the curriculum. And I think we're learning based on work by Pam and many others that the instructional routines that are built into curriculum can support safe classrooms. They can support students feeling confident about analyzing, taking on multiple perspectives. They can build the muscle of how do you take difficult topics and talk about them to disagree respectfully, or they can be curriculum that support kids like doing, worksheets. And we need to build more curriculum. My view is that curriculum can be a real engine for change if designed well and used well, and clearly has to be a tool for teachers, not handcuffs for teachers.
So let's go there. Good. I'm glad you got there a little quicker than I thought, but it's great. I want to go to the adults. So Carol, talk a little bit about the knowledge and skills that you think adults need in order to work with the kind of curriculum that you want to see happening, right? It doesn't happen without adults knowing something and being able to do something. So what is it that adults need to know and be able to do in order to achieve what you lay out in your piece?
So I want to connect that to something I was thinking, particularly as Joe was talking. And I believe, Joe, you and I may have been on some other discussion panel that Spencer provided. Yeah. You were talking about the multiple kinds of infrastructure you created in your district, like housing supports, grocery in terms of, food deserts and the like. And if I'm correct on that, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. That that the focus that you've had in your district, in this case, happening to hang your hat on mathematics, is not about a single shot. If I just bring in a curriculum that does X, Y, or Z, or for that matter, to your question, Josh, if I provide the appropriate professional development for teachers to be able to carry this out, that somehow those sort of singular bullets in and of themselves are sufficient. So I think part of what Joe has done in his district is to have a conception of a school system as a site of ecological supports for a community along multiple dimensions. And those supports for the community along multiple dimensions help everybody. They help the teacher in the classroom to know that I don't have a kid coming in who's hungry. I don't have a kid coming in who's sleeping on the street and going from one family to the next, because this community, this school with its public funding and its outreach has conceptualized that the support for children have to be holistic. I will tell my own little math story. that in high school, my goal, I thought I wanted to be a math teacher. My father loved mathematics, long personal story on that. He used to tell me everything in the world is mathematics.
Yeah.
My mother and father divorced when I was 4, and I thought the way to connect with my daddy was through math. By my junior year, and I did very well in math and I loved it, by my junior year, our trig teacher sent us to Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm growing up on the west side of Chicago, living in public housing. First time on a college campus. The 4 of us who went, the only Black student in this big, college classroom, etc. And I said, I didn't know what the dude was doing. I said it was like speaking Greek. Of course, he was using Greek symbols or whatever. But the point was that there was nobody, that the trig teacher did a fine job of teaching me trigonometry. I didn't have a problem learning the mathematics. But no, he didn't ask, did we go? Nobody helped me make sense of that disconnect when I went into that environment. So my point of this, because our audience is largely one of funders, is when you're thinking about priorities for funding, I think you want to think about curriculum as sitting inside of an ecosystem and how you can think about providing supports that have the stakeholders in that ecosystem talking to one another, collaborating with one another, and figuring out how the multiple resources in that ecosystem can work in a collaborative way to build robust learning environments for kids. I will also say that in addition to what we typically think about, teachers need to learn robust, conceptual knowledge. I mentioned in the article this study Li Ping Ma did back in the 90s, comparing Chinese teachers and US teachers' knowledge of mathematics. She gave them a 5th grade teachers from both countries a problem involving division of fractions with unlike denominators. All of them could solve the problem. Then they said, well, why do you change the operation from division to multiplication, or why do you invert the numerator and denominator? Not one 5th grade teacher could explain why. They could solve it, but they couldn't tell why. Every Chinese teacher had multiple mathematical explanations. So deep conceptual content knowledge is clearly one of those pieces, Josh, right? And understanding conceptual change and all the things Pam talked about, relationship building and all of that. But there's another dimension of this that I think speaks to these larger issues of equity that I see coming up in the chat here. And that is, there's a tendency in the United States in particular, in curriculum development, to focus only on the origins of knowledge from particular parts of the world. Right. As opposed to saying, when I was teaching 3rd grade, I think I talk about this in the article as well, and I was teaching kids about the base 10 system. And I taught them about the Arabic origins of base 10. I taught them about the Yoruba counting system that's based on a base 5. I taught them about the computation, the base 2 in computer programming, with the point of helping them to understand that besides, George, you're talking about who you see, it's also what are the sources of knowledge. There is no discipline that we study in the context of schooling that does not have contributions from across the world, because we live in a highly interdependent world. And I think that's another dimension of curriculum development that funders may want to consider, that's equally a part of this sense. It's not just a sense of personal relevance, but it's about developing really a deeper understanding that mathematics is socially organized to explain certain kinds of phenomena. Science is socially organized to explain certain kinds of phenomena. So you have work, Megan Bang, my colleague from Northwestern, Vice President of Spencer Foundation, and her work on indigenous epistemologies about relationships between human beings and the rest of the natural world. That's another piece of this picture of curriculum that's often not on the table.
So let's get into the ecosystem question, right? And I'm actually going to go Joe first on this. And I want to go back to the equity issues because it is coming up in the chat, particularly around assessment. But we've been defining equity in many ways for the last 20 years of this past generation of either you hit the standard or you don't, and you got to move kids up to the standard, right? And that achievement gap is the measure of equity, right? We've obviously been getting into larger, much deeper and more important issues over the last few years. But, when we think about creating the kind of ecosystem that Carol describes, and we think about creating an ecosystem that in many ways students and adults are learning from and with each other, and 77% of teachers are white females, how do you actually lead that work? How do you start that conversation? How do you, excuse me, weave equity into it so that you change what adults are doing with kids every day, not just content-wise, but belief-wise, right? Because they have to believe it. So Joe, talk a little about how you've gone about that.
Yeah, that's a big one, Josh. I think that, when we look at our teachers here in Ferguson, 76% of our teachers are white females. And the students who have the most issues when it comes to discipline, because our data bear it out, are Black males. And so we come away with our problem of practice of those relationships that they have in the classroom. Because we're seeing a lot of our Black male students being referred to the principal's office for various and sundry reasons, but we wanted to know why. And so there's a disconnect between what their experiences were, these Black males with these white females in the classroom, and how do we bring together, these two groups in a place where they can coexist and learn from each other, and add value. Our district has written some anti-racism standards that really causes us to think deeply about who we are as individuals. If you're white, who and what your experience was. If you're Black, likewise, and how you show up every day, because it's really important for us to do our own work around how I think about people who don't look like me. And that's been really important for the conversation that we're constantly having here in Ferguson. And then when I can change the way I think about and embrace the voice of students in our classrooms, then what happens is you change their value. You add to their value. You can't take away from it, but they can feel like you do. It's so important for teachers to validate students when they come to class and have something to add to the conversation. From a math perspective, how do you get students there? Teachers have to believe that my Black son can do AP calculus. Now, while he's gotten the training and support at home from a dad who's a math teacher, every child doesn't come with that, especially our Black kids. But it's not just doing well in math, being able to solve the problems, right? Like, it's really about, I've heard it already, like, how do I learn to understand so that I can apply this learning? And so what we try to do, what we are doing is we have to stop teaching sort of the pacing and teach for mastery. Like, how do I understand this content? And then how do I use this content? And that's been a game changer. We're doing standards-based grading now. So we're focusing more on when do students master the content? Then they can go to the next place, instead of we go through our grading periods, we do a report card and we do these assessments and they get the grade, and then we move to the next thing. And there's no real, deep understanding of whether or not we knew they really got it. We're focusing more on students actually not just mastering the content, but actually being able to use that content to build and to create. And that's the piece that's changing the way we have the conversation. Like, we know how to put structures in place as educators, but we've got to do it, and it has to be iterative so that we get students to deeply understand, and then how to build. I want my son building and creating based on what his interests are. And so his voice matters when he comes to the table. And then the skills that he gets from the teachers and my wife and I and others in his ecosystem, if you will, those things merge together as he builds and creates. Like, it just changes the game for our students. And so that's the work we're doing constantly in our classrooms. And I think it's important to make teachers the centerpiece, because they're the ones who are in the trenches with our babies every day. And I believe strongly in supporting our teachers and giving them the content they need, but also the ability to apply that content. And so that's kind of helped us some in Ferguson.
Hey, I was going to go to you next. And I had a question for you, but please, you raised your hand. So how do you want to jump in on this?
I think that Carol and Joe and Judy are also really talking about this next wave of school design, and the idea that what we're really being asked to do is to build an ecosystem that is a learning ecosystem for the adults as well as the kids. And in fact, Carol was part of a big piece of work that we did together with Linda Darling Hammond and many others to build out something called the Principles of Whole Child Design, so that there could be a roadmap, not a prescriptive one. Okay, what Joe was just talking about was a learning ecosystem that was going to result in many, many fewer kids, particularly African-American kids, walked off to a principal's office, because the ecosystem has relationships, belonging, rich learning experiences, 21st century skills and mindsets, including the kind of cognitive muscle that it takes to do AP calculus and supports. But we can't, these are not islands, okay? And skill development is not an island, but we can build those kinds of ecosystems if we get away from false choices and binary solutions.
So I want, while you have the floor, Pam, I wanted to push a little bit on this question of the adult mindsets, right? You think a lot about child development and what kids need to know, like how kids are the kind of environment that will best attend to them so they can learn. But adults are learning too, right? And they don't learn as well as kids do. It's really hard. But we know that if adults don't learn something new, not just about content, but there's also the emotional aspect, particularly, you know, this is also about racial equity. And there's also the notion of what is it that particularly white people have to learn in order to be able to teach Black and brown kids and kids that are not white in general. Like, what's the adult development work that needs to happen in order to create this ecosystem of the future that you all are describing?
Well, it is striking to me when I sit, particularly with Linda and other colleagues, about what adults are being asked to do when they don't know how learning happens, when they haven't had as part of their pre-service curriculum learning something about how the brain develops. But once you start to have that foundational knowledge, you know that the relationships that you are going to form to kids are going to be read by kids as, I believe in you and I believe in the success that you can have. I can help get you there through mentoring and scaffolding. But without that, and without an attention to the fact that right now we're assuming that adults just come in with that, and they don't. There is an adult development side of this that is probably right now where so much more of the focus should go, and it's on relationship plus content. Even when you look at the 2 Sigma paper that talked about the role of mentoring in driving academic gains, 2 standard deviations. This paper, when the data was analyzed, showed that what drove the gains in academics was the nature of the relationship the child had with the tutor. This is Benjamin Bloom's work. So I think we have to know that putting relationships first and enabling adults to develop those capacities is a very, very high priority for that ecosystem building.
Yeah, I used to say when I was superintendent of schools that that I should be held accountable for the extent to which I would organize systems for adult learning, right, which will lead to better student learning. But I feel like we jump over that step too much, and it's just, oh, we'll just buy the program, right? Buy investigations in math, and then that'll solve the problem, right? So Judy, let's talk about managing expectations, right? This is all great. Everything, you know, so we have the science, we know what to do. Here you got one leader out of 13,000 superintendents in the country is doing it right, right? You know, read Carol's article, it's all solved. But then we got all this stuff that goes into this, and it's not just about curriculum. So as you think about managing people's expectations, like what's the right unit of change? What's the approach? How should we be? And again, this is a long trajectory. Things happen over generations. So as we think about the next 25 years, where do we start? What's that unit of change that we should begin with as we want to create this new ecosystem?
I think one of the challenges in education is if you try to do something just at one level, it's very hard to make sustained change. I do believe it's really important to anchor your vision, if not your work, at least your vision on what happens in the classroom. The great Dick Elmore talks about the relationship between the teacher, the student, and content, and that's where learning happens. And we know from lots of work on policy that you can have a lot of policy change and not get at that instructional triangle. So whatever you're doing, you need to think through how you get to change there. But then, as Carol has so eloquently said, it's in an ecosystem at the school level and a learning community at the school level, and then the kind of system-wide changes that districts are best positioned to support. I would also say on curriculum, we have seen a lot of activity over the last few years from states who are seeing that states have a role in helping their districts understand what's available, how important high quality instructional materials can be to advance their aims, to help districts think through like what's your vision of instruction and what curriculum might match that vision of instruction that you've developed with your community. And then finally, curriculum sits within a marketplace. It's a very large market. And if we're going to have the kind of resources that students deserve and teachers deserve that reflect the kind of conversation we're having today, you're going to have to change market incentives. And there's been some work through organizations like Ed Reports to look at curriculum, but there's so much more to be done there. But if we don't have the options available, we're not going to be where we need to be. At this point, there are some decent options, there's some in the pipeline, but so much more to do to make sure that they reflect the diversity of our student population and really support teachers in an educative way to be able to build the relationships and the instructional routines that reflect what we know about teaching and learning.
So I encourage people to put things in the chat, and we're going to do some Q&A, but I wanted to ask a question also about that may have just gone, oh, I know what it was. So we're having this conversation these days. When I say we, the conversation is being forced on educators to think about who should be involved in curriculum, right? And the transparency of curriculum and all that kind of stuff, right? But how do we think about families and community and the roles that they should be playing in this question of what kids should be learning and how they should be learning it? And I know we'll be talking about teaching and learning in another time, but in terms of what they should be learning, what's the role of community and families in this? And I'll just open up to any. Let's try to keep it relatively short because I want to get to Q&A and then we're going to wrap up. So what role do non-experts or I guess parents and community experts, but beyond the central office and the schools, what role should families and community play in curriculum?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly because I want to go back to something Carol said earlier about just this whole ecosystem that we have to make sure we create. And as Judy was talking, you know, it was like what's in the classroom and what's happening in the classroom every day is so critically important. You know, we've redone our student services department because it's so important to help students show up and address the whole child, right? Like, what are those things that each child, not each child, is experiencing when they show up in school every day? And we have our children who come from different, you know, backgrounds. We have some children who come from a nuclear family and mom and dad's in place and that they have everything they need, to kids who struggle just to get here today and for whatever reason. And one of the pieces I think is really important is how do we identify what those barriers are that students are having before they get to us, then how do we mitigate those barriers? Because if we don't do that, they keep showing up and we keep processing them, which is one of the reasons I saw, you know, in the chat that why we have that prison to pipeline, that from school to prison pipeline. And we have to interrupt that by making sure we address those needs that students have. But for curriculum and those non-experts, right, like parents have to be at the table. Their voices are so important. We are undertaking a piece. We're doing our strategic plan work right now. And I have one of our former students, he's in grad school at Stanford, and he's working with a buddy of mine who's a professor at Brown on participatory budgeting. And for those who may not know what that is, that's bringing the family into the entity, whether it be a municipality, in our case, a school district, and giving them a voice at the table about how we spend public dollars, right? Like, that's really important because, for one, parents have to be educated on what is a budget in terms of this, from this sort of macro perspective, and how does, my tax dollars impact what happens when my child is getting educated? And so I think it's really important for our children and our families to see like what that process looks like, and then to have a voice at the table and seeing that money being spent in ways that benefits my community. And I think what happens is it empowers our parents to be a part of the process. And I don't think that we can go wrong by asking grandmom, who quite a few of our families are led by grandmoms, or moms, single parent homes headed by women, to give them a voice. And I think that as we do that, we'll see teachers in particular, because teachers are at the core of this. We can't do this work without them. But when they see that, Johnny, who came in your class, is struggling with learning for whatever reason, that means he can't. He has some barriers that he's experiencing. And when they can connect with those families and see what happened, then we can remove some of those barriers. And how more powerful than to have your teacher do that.
Right. So, and I know, Carol, I wanted to get on this. I want to bring it back to something you were talking about there, Carol, which is the idea, and Joe is sort of describing this, that in many ways, public education serves a civic responsibility. And it's not civics class, right? It's this larger responsibility we have to be with each other around this idea that we're preparing our kids to thrive in their future. So how do you, talk a little bit about the role of families? And when I say a little bit, we'll try to keep it short, everybody. I am trying to moderate, not very well, but if you can talk about the role of families and community in building this ecosystem of civics, right? Of a civic society.
One of the issues that we talked about in this National Academy of Education report focused on discourse and the issue of engaging families in the work of schooling and what and how their children are taught, as we can see in what's going on today in these contestations around how we're going to address issues around race and parents wanting to ban books and the like, suggests that this isn't just a simple happy, let's pat each other on the back set of discussions, right? And so it seems to me that schools have to be in a position, whether that's the individual school, school administration, or at the district level, for example, to figure out how can we organize engagement and collaborations with families in ways that are able to address concerns, for example, that families may have about, I don't want my kid to do this. I don't want him to read this book, or you want him to take calculus and I want him to be ready to go to a union job directly after that, and you're taking him off in a different direction. So these same conditions that Pam has talked about in terms of a sense of relevance, a sense of safety, a sense of relationship building, has to also undergird, it seems to me, the nature of the kinds of interactions that schools and parents and families have, and understanding that public education is both addressing the needs of children and families, but simultaneously addressing a conception of a larger public good that may or may not be on the immediate table of the families. I also want to say that often in our discussions, and we tried to address this in part in that civics report, is around the equity challenges. Often the white children living in Appalachia and the white children living in the Mississippi Delta are not on the screen. And we have this sort of bifurcated notion that white kids are some single homogeneous group who are all doing great. And then there are the colored kids, so we're talking about the Black and brown. There's some fundamental issues. We don't have time to talk about them here, but of understanding how the very constructions of race as this undergirding force that drives our discussions leads us into directions of us and them, right? Without understanding the kind of overlaps and the fact that race is a political construction. That's all that it is, right? There's a book, When the Irish Became White. You can think about the eugenics movement, where the psychologists would be sitting at Ellis Island, and when the Eastern Europeans got off the boat or Jews got off the boat, they gave them a 5-minute IQ test, that they're morons, they shouldn't be here. So this is a very complex sort of territory. And we need to be able then in schooling, it seems to me, to for the professional stakeholders, teachers, administrators, district level people, to have the what I'm going to call a scientific knowledge base around human learning and development, to think about how do we coordinate those kinds of discussions. What you see on the news are these 5-minute people get up in front of a school board and they scream at each other and they sit down and everybody screams. There's no discussion. There's no opportunity to engage with the complexity.
So
I'm
getting,
one last quick thing. I know I'm blind. And that a fundamental issue, it seems to me, is about reconceptualizing the nature of the profession of teaching. You do not become a doctor. Pam is a physician, right? A medical doctor and a psychologist. She's everything right on that end. But you don't go to medical school and take a test and go out and treat people. You have an ongoing, after that formal education, you have an ongoing internship where somebody who's highly expertise is trying to help you understand the context in which. And then if we take international examples, in China, in Japan, something like lesson study, there's no assumption that teachers are, you get to a point, we put you in the classroom, bye-bye, you're on your own, we'll give you some curriculum and that will solve the problem. It's about creating schools as sites of inquiry and ongoing learning. So that
and one where families, community, kids are involved. So Pam and Judy, I'm gonna ask you, because we have just a couple minutes left. I want to touch on something that Carol said and ask you to quickly respond to it, and then we'll come back. If schools are designed as the ranking and sorting mechanism for American society, right? They were designed to otherize in many ways. Then what should we stop doing? And when I say we, funders, educators, policymakers, right? What's one thing, I'm trying to weave in some of the questions in there too, we should stop doing, and what's one thing we should start doing in order to start organizing around this ecosystem that you all been talking about? So what do we stop doing? One thing we stop doing, and one thing we start doing, Pam and Judy.
I mean, the easiest thing to stop doing is anything that produces exclusion of a child from a learning community. And that can happen many different ways. One way Joe Davis mentioned, through discipline, but it can happen even through the learning process itself. So I say all forms of exclusion get replaced by tremendous opportunities for belonging.
Stop excluding, right? There's an article that just came out today from the Fordham Institute about tracking is a good thing, right? I don't know if I agree with it, but
Stop excluding, promote belonging.
promote belonging.
Okay.
Yes. Judy.
So my stop is very similar to Pam. I think that in our schools, we have tremendous incoherence where we're pulling out students for interventions and supplemental activities and depriving them of the rich learning opportunities that they need desperately. In terms of start doing, in addition to building coherence, I think we need to be thinking about equitable design processes where we reach out to families and communities and the students who need the most supports to hear from them about what's most important to change.
Got it. So I have a couple other sort of quick questions. Joe, because we have a bunch of funders on this call, right? And if someone were to come and say, here's $2 million, right, to spend it on what, organizing towards this ecosystem that we've been describing to get Ferguson Florissant where it needs to be in 25 years, what are the top 3 things you would be spending it on? What is it that people should say, this is what we would do to get us there?
Math, and more math. No,
so I knew you would say that, man.
Yeah, math absolutely would be, but specific in elementary schools, and I would, really sort of use a sort of a dichotomous approach. I think that, earlier on, we have to make sure teachers have the content they need in elementary school to make sure that they are able to do that work well.
Teacher content knowledge, right? Increasing teacher content knowledge.
Right. The other piece is the actual curriculum that students are using with those teachers in those elementary schools is critically important, right? Because if that doesn't happen, then, we just keep spinning our wheels. I think the other piece, though, is the socio-emotional components of it, right? Like, we have to make sure that for students to be able to access that curriculum and those teachers I'm talking about, we have to remove those barriers. And that is, to me, so concentrated. There's so many things that happen for children before they even get to us. How do we, create structures and student services So I think therapy is one of those pieces, especially in the Black community, that we don't have enough of in our community and in our schools, so that students really can sort of parse out, why am I struggling in this way, and how do I show up in a way that I can eventually get to AP Calculus. So teacher content knowledge, curriculum, and then the therapeutic piece.
But I would, and I would love to hear really quickly, Carol and Pam weigh in on this, the attention to the sort of therapeutic environment, the mental health needs, the sense of belonging. That's not in isolation.
Right.
That's not an event, right? That can't be seen as something that's done on Thursday mornings at 9:45, right? Like, is that a correct sort of assumption that it has to be woven into the entire ecosystem?
There's a podcast that I just did on the youth mental health crisis. And if we created environments of the kind that we're describing right now, they would be healing environments in which the amount and severity of mental health issues would change dramatically, putting us in a position to use scarce resources well, get intensive care to the kids who need it, but have all kids in environments that are genuinely healing and supportive all day long.
All right, so Olga's gotten on, which means I hear the gong that's trying to get me off. But I want to very quickly, in like one thing you've seen recently, each of you, that gives you hope, right? I know you work with teachers, you work with schools, you see what's going on. One quick thing that has given you hope out there for our future. I'll go Judy, Pam, Joe, Carol. Judy, one thing that gives you hope these days.
So I recently re-looked at an expeditionary learning EL education video that anyone can get on their website and see, which is of a class in which high school students, all students of color, I think, are studying over policing, and they're reading the new Jim Crow and reports on over policing, and having an in-depth, thoughtful, text-based discussion about things that matter to them.
People are doing the work, right? There are examples. Pam, one thing that's giving you hope out there.
A group of kids in a district who were so committed to their advisory structure that they asked the principal if they could have the same 3 advisories a day when the pandemic ended. And the principal said, absolutely.
Wow.
We start the day with an advisory, we have an advisory at lunch, and we close the day with an advisory.
Awesome. Joe.
I think it would be, again, student voice and them directing their own learning, that their voice is at the table, creating those pathways. And I think nothing's more powerful than to see a child have an interest, and then we help them develop what that interest is as a part of their learning process.
Awesome. Love it. Carol, what's giving you hope?
I think what gives me hope is that there are so many living examples of learning environments in schools and communities that reflect what we're talking about, but we don't know anything about them. So one project that the Grantmakers could think about is creating some sort of platform to make public and visible in a national way, and looking even at international examples of school communities and communities that are organizing themselves in precisely the way that we're talking about, and to make sure that those illustrations include some way of all stakeholders, teachers, kids themselves, district level people and community, to talk about what this means and how they've gotten involved. I think this would do a lot to help us have a different vision for what's possible.
It is possible. The question is scale. So I went overboard went over time, and probably overboard too. But Judy, Pam, Joe, Carol, thank you so much. Everybody out there, and I'll turn it over to Olga, but please continue reading the work in Kappan that Raphael and others have been working on and bringing out to the world. We're really proud of it, and we love and appreciate the support of Grantmakers for Education and the Spencer Foundation. Thank you all for being on this panel. It's great seeing everybody. Olga, I will turn it over to you, right, for the last word. And thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you in the audience. You've been incredibly engaged. I was just thinking we want to try and scrape some of the recommendations of books and other things that are in the chat. I do want to let you know that we have a video of this that will be available on our site within about a week. We've got a couple of programs. It's very interesting, the conversation about adult competencies on the 22nd of February at 2 p.m. We do have a call with Arizona State University, a couple of funders and partners, really talking about the teaching workforce and thinking differently about what that looks like, having teams of educators kind of being wrapped around students as opposed to the one teacher, one student model. Tomorrow, we have Race Literacy and Healing 101, a foundation for change that's open to all funders. And then we do have our leaders speaking out on the opportunities of the moment. We'll have Becky Pringle from NEA and Randy Weingarten from AFT. So please join us for upcoming programs and have a great day.